For those of you who do not know, until March of this year, I had a radio show here in Washington on WMAL, a morning show. And for about the last 12 to 15 months, my show featured, not to the exclusion of everything else, but along with myself and my wife, and by the way, every member of this panel who has appeared on our show at some point, began to talk a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood, stealth jihad, and the war within the information battle space that parallels the kinetic wars that we're fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this, I want to stress, went on without criticism or pushback for about 15 months. It culminated in a large public forum at the Capitol Visitor Center right over here on Capitol Hill that had eminent scholars from the Heritage Foundation and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and other contributors to our show, foreign policy experts, all talking to some degree about this. And the response was very enthusiastic. Shortly after that, the managers, the general managers and the operation directors of our show pulled me into their office and said, we want you to stop doing this. And I said, there seems to be an appetite for this particular subject, and besides, we're only doing it for a segment or two a week on a show that ran 20 hours a week. And so my wife and I, knowing that we had been perhaps warned, went forward, and the upshot was they pulled me back into the office again and said, we're firing your wife, but you can stay. At that point, I told them what they could do. And I guess to think of myself as a casualty to this is to, of course, remind you that if you do a morning show, you usually have to go to bed at 6 p.m. so you can get up at 1:30. This is a lifestyle that morning radio hosts share with dairy farmers and vampires. So let me just say at the outset, and I do not know, but if the Muslim Brotherhood or their affiliate organizations in this country and elsewhere were involved in pulling me off the air, let me just say thank you. My life has returned to normal, and now I can work full-time on what I did part-time on the radio. And what I want to do in my piece of this is, Amanda has given you kind of the ancient history of the spread of Islam, and Andy has given you some of the more immediate history, but I want to talk, to use the title of one of Andy's book, about the willful blindness that exists right now among prevailing government organizations in dealing with assessing this enemy threat doctrine, which I think it's fair to say is masquerading as a religion and an ideology, but has another agenda, even though you couldn't tell it from anybody in the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, Justice, or State. And let me begin by trotting out some of the usual suspects that you know. Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, his copycat, Nasser Abdo, Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, of course Anwar al-Awlaki, who was to some degree the eminence grise for a lot of these guys, and himself a terrorist. Carlos Bledsoe, also known as Abdul Hakim, the Little Rock shooter, and the newest member is this fellow from Massachusetts, Azwan Fardous, who is supposedly responsible for the alleged drone attack on the Pentagon. Every one of these individuals announced and continued to affirm that they were soldiers of Allah, that they were involved in a struggle that was larger than them, and they were self-declared jihadists without provocation. Faisal Shahzad, when he was hauled in front of a district judge, said, I am just the little droplet of a huge wave to come. And every one of these individuals essentially was following what they believed to be the strict adherence to Islamic doctrine, which is to announce what you are going to do to give your enemies full warning. And Nidal Hassan, no less than 23 times, announced to his superiors that if you force me to fight against my Muslim brothers, I will turn and fire on American soldiers, which is exactly what he did. And yet, to this day, whether we're looking at Department of Defense analysis or Department of Justice analysis, there is still no mention that there was any religious or ideological basis for these recurring acts of violence. That really, I think, stretches the imagination to believe this, particularly when we know now that these individuals were really, at least in their minds, soldiers of Allah and fulfilling their responsibilities as mujahideen. I couldn't help thinking when Andy was talking about the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is based right here in Northern Virginia, along with most of the predominant Muslim Brotherhood institutions, that one of the first people to go to Fort Hood in the aftermath of Nid al-Hassan to talk to the troops and the families was Louis Safi, who is affiliated with the International Islamic Institute of Thought and is himself supposedly part of what is arguably a Muslim Brotherhood institution. So not only are we allowing perhaps this kind of ideology to penetrate, but we are also turning to some of these individuals for care and comfort. Which brings me to a more recent event, which I think is just as troubling. The Department of Homeland Security has recently put out a white paper, the title of which is a little longer than this, but essentially says it is empowering local partners to deal with violent extremism in their communities. It is supposedly a working paper on how to deal with terrorism, although that word is very rarely mentioned, and in terms of Islamic fundamentalism or jihad or any of the terms, those hardly appear at all, and for good reason. This paper essentially says that what you must not do is use any kind of religious underpinning or ideology in dealing with these kinds of attacks. It provides no presiding federal authority, not the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of Justice, not anything in between, to look over this entire spectrum of violence. By the way, something that has drawn the criticism of both chairs of the House and Senate Homeland Security Committees, Joe Lieberman and Peter King. And it also says pretty definitively that if there is a conflict in your community between law enforcement and what they're trying to do and community outreach and what they're trying to do, you should always come down on the side of community outreach. Going back to what Andy was talking about with the arrest and successful prosecution of the blind sheikh, it's hard to conceive how Raymond Kelly, the police commissioner of New York, could have even arrested, captured, and brought to trial the blind sheikh had he been forced to live under these kinds of guidelines that are now being promulgated to deal with terrorism right now. These are the kinds of things that are now, I think, if not affecting our policies yet in a large way, or our legal system, certainly are beginning to change our culture. And as Frank said, I think beginning to compromise what we've always presumed are kind of First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, due process. And so this is what I think is the most important aspect of this, is our opponents have forced us to use a vernacular that they have created themselves. We are not allowed to use the terms that effectively define the enemy because they are politically incorrect. They have no such problem in defining us. And I want to end with this particular note, because in addition to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, another place I think we have to look now is the State Department, not just internationally, but here at home as well. As it so happened yesterday, I began my day by attending a seminar at the Hudson Institute on the slaughter of Coptic Christians in Egypt, and particularly the Maspero massacre that took place on October 9th. And three eminent scholars talking effectively but dispassionately about this tragedy, and of course alluding to the growing political power of the Muslim Brotherhood and their affiliate organizations in Egypt. And like so many of these kind of multisyllabic think tank confabs, it described the problem without really getting into the horror of it. But the conclusion was that there was no situation that will emerge from whatever government Egypt decides upon that will provide any kind of scenario of hope for the 10 million or so Coptic Christians that are trying to survive in Egypt under this new government. This, of course, is the same kind of Muslim Brotherhood that the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, said is largely a secular organization last spring when he testified in front of the House Intelligence Committee, as if they were the equivalent of the Kiwanis Club of Greater Cairo. Shortly after that, David Reboy, my colleague at the center, and I happened to walk up Pennsylvania Avenue and get involved in the protest march by the Coptic Christians who had come to this town to protest what is going on with them. And really, without trying, we got swept up into what their argument is. And we're talking about a group that represents maybe 500,000 people in the United States. And what so many of them said to us, I think, is something that we need to take away right now. These are American citizens who are paying taxes to the United States government, which are turning around and in some cases giving those taxes back to sustain military aid in Egypt, which is aiding and abetting this slaughter, and at the very least standing by and allowing it to happen. That is something that is largely missing when you look at the Washington Post this morning, which has a nice picture of what went on, but the story is on B3. In other words, this is a metro section story. This is something that's happening in the District of Columbia, and the story itself doesn't go anywhere near talking about what is happening to this group in Egypt under Sharia law. They are second-class citizens. To some degree, they've made their peace with that. One of the problems that they're encountering right now is they're trying to rebuild their churches, and under strict Sharia, that is not allowed. They've acquiesced already and said, all right, we won't put crosses outside the church. If you insist, we won't have domes. But even accommodating those concerns is not enough, apparently, under what looks to be the new regime. So after spending about an hour with these folks and hearing firsthand how they as American citizens are terribly afraid, not just of what will happen to their relatives in Egypt, but what is happening in this country with the Muslim Brotherhood and organizations that are trying to at least insinuate these kinds of Islamophobic preconditions into how we deal with threats, was a real eye-opener. But I want to just end with what happened when I got back to my office, because we received a story about a conference that had taken place at George Washington Law School on Tuesday, which was, I believe it's described as a 9/11 discrimination conference put on by the Department of Justice and featuring some pretty eminent people like Tom Perez, who's head of the Civil Rights Division, and most specifically Dwight C. Holton, who's a former U.S. attorney and current senior litigation authority. And what they were trying to do was once again parse out the threat to make sure that whenever we dealt with a terrorist, religion never was part of that evaluation. And this is what Holton said. This is a quote. I want to be perfectly clear about this. Training materials that portray Islam as a religion of violence or with a tendency towards violence are wrong, they are offensive, and they are contrary to everything that this President, this Attorney General, and Department of Justice stands for. They will not be tolerated. And that, I think, now is a prevailing ethic, certainly within the Department of Justice and maybe across the entire administration. I'm drawing this from an article that was put together by Diana West, who is another person that we have engaged to talk about this and is very much an authority. And she counters this argument with a quote from Abu Qatada, who is a well-known person in the Islamic movement, referred to as Osama bin Laden's spiritual guide. And this is what he says: "I am astonished by President Bush when he claims there is nothing in the Quran that justifies jihad or violence in the name of Islam. Is he some kind of Islamic scholar? Has he never actually read the Quran?" Now, what we're dealing with are people like Dwight Holton and Eric Holder and Thomas Perez saying all of this stuff about Islam is a false negative. If that's true, the book that Andy just put his hand on is a false negative. And so is the Quran. And this is the disconnect that we are trying to deal with right now. And I have to tell you that obviously I've been involved in this for some time. But if you just spend a little bit of time talking with American citizens who are Coptic Christians and dealing today and probably going forward with the imminent, if not demise, certainly diminution of their population in their home country, and perhaps the marginalization of them in this country along with the rest of us, it is very much an eye-opening event and something I hope we start paying more attention to. And I will yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman.